was driving home from work one night, following my usual route. I left at midnight, so it was probably around 12:15 at that point. My town is pretty quiet and boring, with lots of forests everywhere and very few people or houses. I was on a road not far from my house, with a cornfield on one side and a patch of forest on the other. It was the middle of summer, and it was about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, so I had the top of my convertible down. I was driving down the street at about 50 miles per hour when I heard a loud scream from a woman coming from one side of the road, but I couldn't tell which side. I quickly stopped the car, slammed on the brakes, and listened. There was a woman crying on the left side in the forest, asking for help. I got out of the car and grabbed the baton from the back seat. I walked toward the forest and shouted, asking who was there, and the woman immediately responded, "Please help me." I started running into the forest, pushing branches and bushes out of my way. I yelled for the woman to keep calling so I could find her. Every 10 seconds, she screamed for help, and I moved in that direction, running and shouting back. But soon, I realized that no matter how far I went into the forest, the woman's screams didn't seem to get any closer or louder. In fact, they always stayed the same distance, even though I was running straight toward them. I shouted, "Tell me where you are," and about 5 seconds later, the woman screamed for help again. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't like this. I started to feel like I was walking into some kind of trap. I turned around and started running back. I ran and ran in the direction I came from until I could see the flashing headlights of my car by the road, through the trees. The whole way back, I still heard the woman's screams, but they were always the same distance away, no matter how close I got to my car, as if she was following me back. I got in my car and just sped out of there, completely freaked out. I called 911 to report the incident to the authorities in case they wanted to investigate. I wasn't sticking around. I was tired. After telling a few friends and family members about the strange encounter, I was ready to move on with my life. But a week later, I saw something on the news that made me feel sick. The body of a woman in her 30s had been found in the forest by a man who was walking his dog. Strangely, there were no signs of foul play. The location where the body was found was reported to be in the same general area where I had heard the screams. Although that part of the forest is really large, I can't help but feel that it would be a huge coincidence. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont, heading to my friend John's cabin to spend a weekend snowboarding. At the time of this story, I had 2 cars, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150, which I was driving that particular night. I had my snowboard gear in the back of the truck. I was about 45 minutes away from my friend's cabin at this point. It was late, around 10 o'clock at night, completely dark on these roads, and it was snowing. There were no other cars on the road besides mine at that hour. I had just gotten my truck back from the mechanic a few weeks ago. I often had problems with that truck, and that night was no exception, at possibly the worst time. On the quietest and darkest road, suddenly, my engine started overheating completely, entering the red zone. I slowed down and pulled over, waiting for it to cool down again. Then, I slowly got back on the road, but even at low speed, the needle went back to red and the engine overheated again. I had to stop and turn off the truck. I went to the hood to try and diagnose the problem, but I couldn't in the dark with snow falling. I had to call John. On this road, T-Mobile reception was non-existent. I couldn't even call for help at that moment. I felt screwed. I went back to the truck to start it again and at least wait in the warmth of the truck while it was idling. It didn't seem to overheat while idling. I tried driving once more, but the same thing happened again, so I had to wait about 10 minutes before I saw a car passing by. I had my hazard lights on and opened the door, waving my arms. The passing car stopped. It was a small Toyota. The guy rolled down the window, and I thanked him for stopping and asked if I could use his phone. He asked what happened. I said my truck was overheating and it was impossible to drive. Then he asked if I was alone. I thought for a second and said yes. He pulled out his phone and handed it to me. He must have been a local because he had a signal. I called my friend John, and he answered. I asked him what I should do. He told me to call a specific tow company nearby and that he would come pick me up. I gave him my exact location, and he said he was on his way. After that, I called the tow company John had mentioned and requested assistance. During the calls, the guy in the car watched me the whole time. I tried not to look back, but after I finished my calls, I handed the phone back to the man and thanked him. He said, "You're welcome," and without saying anything else, rolled up the window and drove down the snowy road, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I watched the taillights completely vanish as he went down below the top of the mountain road above. I was alone again. I got back in my idling truck to stay in the warmth. I turned off the headlights for a second just to see how dark it really was, and when I say I couldn't see an inch outside the windows, I'm not exaggerating. It was pure darkness. I sat in the truck waiting and waiting. There was nothing I could do that required an internet connection. I ended up playing on my phone for about 20 minutes until there was a knock on the passenger window. I jumped in fright when I looked at the window, but I couldn't see much of the person. It was too dark out there. The headlights didn't really light up the sides of the truck. I heard a man's voice starting to beg for help, yelling for me to open the door because he was freezing. I heard him trying to open the door himself, but it was locked. I pointed my flashlight at the window, but it barely helped to see who was out there. All I could see was someone in a very large black coat, with the hood covering their head. I yelled back, asking what was wrong, and the mysterious man outside responded saying that he was lost and abandoned and needed to get out of the cold. I didn't trust it. I sat there nervously, trying to figure out what to ask him to prove he wasn't trying to hurt me. I couldn't even think of what to say before he started trying to open the locked door more aggressively and banging on the glass harder, still screaming for help. In the heat of the moment, I decided to trust my instinct. I put the truck in gear, and he realized what I was doing, starting to pound harder on the window to break it. I drove the truck back onto the road and sped up to 30 miles per hour, despite the damage I was surely causing to the overheating engine. But then I saw something I didn't expect, something that made my heart feel like it stopped for a second. As I went up the hill on the road, I noticed the reflection of taillights pulling off to the side. As I passed the parked car, I realized it was the same Toyota from earlier, the one the man was driving. I slowed down and rolled down the window to see if the man was inside the car, but I didn't see anything. It looked like the car was empty. I looked out the window for a second behind the car, and my taillights illuminated footprints in the snow, meaning that the man who had been pounding on my window was him. And he was trying to trick me into opening the door and doing God knows what. I kept driving my truck, knowing full well that I was destroying the engine, but I didn't care at that moment. I stopped a few minutes later when I saw headlights approaching from the other side, and I wanted to cheer with joy when I realized it was the tow truck. I flashed my headlights, and he pulled over to the side. When the driver got out, I told him what had just happened. He joked that he had arrived just in time, then asked if the guy had a weapon or anything with him, but I said I couldn't see. He replied, "Well, let's do this quickly then." It took about 15 minutes for him to hook up the truck, and during that time, the Toyota never passed by. It was possible he had turned around and gone the other way for that exact reason. I used the tow truck driver's phone to call John again and tell him to meet us at the shop. Long story short, John and I still went snowboarding that weekend, and the shop replaced the broken water pump in my truck, which was causing the overheating. I sold that truck a few weeks later. I'm glad I didn't roll down the window or unlock the doors for that man trying to get into my car in that situation. I could have been killed, and no one would ever know who did it. I had my first girlfriend when I was 17. I lived with my mom at the time because my parents got divorced when I was 11. One day, I asked my girlfriend out on a date and she said yes. We both had jobs. I worked at a local supermarket and she worked at a Starbucks. We both worked day shifts and were also in our senior year of high school. The reason I asked her out that day was because it was a Friday and we barely had any homework. After work, I picked her up from her house and we went to a small restaurant. It was 10 minutes away from my house because that's all I could afford at the time. We ate and then went back to her house to spend some time together. When we arrived, it was already dark. She complained that our date was short, and I told her I couldn't take her anywhere else that would cost money. We agreed to go for a night drive. We drove around the city and then took an empty road into the forest. Eventually, the pavement ended, and we were on a dirt road. I really needed to pee. I told my girlfriend, and she also needed to. We stopped the car and got out. For some reason, as soon as we stepped out of the car, we smelled something horrible, indescribable. I made an excuse, saying it could be someone else who had stopped to use the bathroom too. My girlfriend even gagged from the smell. I told her we would do our business quickly and get back to the car to return to the city. There was a flat area that was the best place to pee. We did what we needed to do and went back to the car. On the way back, we heard a noise coming from our left. It sounded like a branch breaking. Afraid it was an animal, we ran back to the car. Before I had time to open the car door, I heard a scream of fear or pain coming from where my girlfriend and I had just peed. I told my girlfriend to get in the car while I checked it out. She begged me not to go, but I went anyway to make her feel safer. I locked the doors. I walked towards where we had been and heard the scream again. For some reason, I lost all my courage when I heard it closer, but when I heard it, it seemed to come from the same direction as the breaking branch. Instead of going in that direction, I took out my phone, turned on the flash, and took a picture. When the flash went off, I saw a man wearing a white shirt with black stripes and a blue tarp right in front of him. He was just standing there. I didn't hesitate to run back to the car. I unlocked the doors, got in, put it in gear, and sped off. My girlfriend kept asking what. She saw that I was scared. I said I would explain later. We drove back to the darker part of the city and then went back to my girlfriend's house. We went inside, into her room. That's when I told her I saw a man with a blue tarp in front of him, just standing there. I showed her the picture, and she was as scared as I was. She let me stay the night because we were both freaked out, and it was a Friday, plus we didn't have work or school. The next day, that was by far the scariest moment of my life. We're not in a relationship anymore. I'm 23 and she's 22, but we're still best friends. It was the end of summer in 2011. I was almost 19 years old and was hanging out with my best friend, who was a few years younger than me. We lived in a very rural area of southwestern Virginia, about 15 minutes from Mount Airy, North Carolina. Around here, almost everything closes by 10 p.m., so you have to find your own ways to pass the time. But that was never a problem for us, as we always found a way to have fun. The night started harmlessly. First, we went to the mall, then drove around looking for girls. Things any teenager would do. When that didn't work, we decided to go bowling until it closed. Afterward, we drove down Main Street, just before heading towards the state line and back to Virginia. The dirt road stretched for miles with only a few houses along it. We were certain we wouldn't come across any other cars out there. The road was surrounded by trees and lay at the base of a small mountain. At night, it was easy to ignore any houses that might have been there. We would have probably passed by all of them without noticing if it weren't for the light we saw in the distance. Out of the corner of our eyes, we noticed a light on. We both looked and saw a man standing under the porch light. We couldn't make out his features, but we could see he was watching us, standing still, except for his head, which followed us as we drove past. Although it made us uneasy, we tried not to think much of it. We figured it was just someone stepping outside to smoke a cigarette. But his posture was unsettling. While nothing happened with that man watching us, that was only the beginning. Gradually, we increased our speed as we moved away. We were trying to forget the strange experience when the unexpected happened. The dirt road began to climb the mountain, and soon we came to a more open area where the road took a sharp turn. As we began to turn, The headlights illuminated something in the middle of the road. There was a car stopped, parked across the path, blocking our way. The headlights revealed two figures standing next to the car. A feeling of imminent danger washed over us. I slowed down but continued to move forward slowly, hoping they would move the car. One of the men started walking toward us, signaling for us to stop. My friend and I exchanged a glance. Something didn't feel right. My intuition was screaming not to stop. I decided to go around the car, pulling off the road to pass by the side. The men started running towards us, yelling something we couldn't understand. I sped up, driving over the grassy area next to the road, and we managed to get back onto the road ahead of their car. As we sped away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the men standing in the road, watching as we drove off. We didn't know what they wanted, but we were relieved that we had followed our instincts and didn't stop. We kept driving without stopping until we got back to town, where we felt safe. We talked about what had happened, trying to figure out what could have happened if we had stopped. That night stayed with us as a reminder that it's not always safe to explore unknown areas, especially at night. Since then, we've been more cautious during our nighttime adventures, always remembering the sense of danger we felt on that isolated dirt road. We grew more nervous as we talked about the experience. Within just a few minutes, we reached the end of the road and were back on the pavement, on a road I was much more familiar with and drove about once a week. We turned right and felt much better, as we could speed up and leave thoughts of that man behind. We enjoyed the views on this road, which runs along the top of a small mountain ridge, offering beautiful views of the town below. After a few miles, we reached the end of this road and made another right to head back to my house. This road is a bit more wooded than the previous one, but I was even more familiar with it, having driven or walked it literally thousands of times. As we approached the main road, we saw something ahead just at the edge of the headlights. Deer are terrible around here, so we assumed it was just one of them and slowed down. We started to notice that it was much larger than a deer's brown fur, but since we were used to occasionally seeing an albino, we still assumed it was just that. As we got closer, we realized it wasn't an animal. It was definitely a human, but hunched over with their back to us, walking in the left lane, facing traffic as recommended. I looked at my friend as he asked what the hell that person was doing walking in that hour of the night. I looked again at the person and finally made out the shape of an older woman with gray, disheveled hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She was still facing away from us until we were about 50 feet from her. That's when she turned towards us, and we saw her face for the first time. I don't want to say she was on meth or other drugs, but that was the impression she gave. Sunken eyes with heavy dark circles, greasy hair, and very aged skin. I don't know how old she really was, but if I had to guess, I'd say she was between 40 and 50 years old. But that wasn't the worst part. She raised her hands and began waving them frantically and running towards us. As she did, we could see what looked like dried blood all over the front of her shirt and pants, along with what seemed to be a large knife in one of her hands. We didn't know what she wanted, but our desire to be bad boys was instantly wiped away. We sped up and didn't slow down until we reached the highway. We were so terrified by the whole incident that what would normally be a quick 5-minute drive to my house turned into a 35-minute detour, just with the absurd thought that she might somehow follow us there. In small communities like this, you know practically everyone, but neither my friend nor I had ever seen that woman before, nor did we see her again. We kept an eye on the local news for stories about a bloody woman being found, but we never heard anything. I can't even begin to imagine an explanation for why she would be walking along rural roads at nearly 4 a.m. in that state and condition, with blood on her clothes and a knife in hand, facing all the risks of an altercation with humans or animals. Fast forward to today, I now live with my wife on that peaceful road on the mountain ridge between the two roads where the incidents happened, and I use the latter almost daily, never having seen any sign of that strange woman since. Earlier this year, there was a major police operation against a drug and cockfighting ring on the road where the man had been watching us. I don't know if it was the same house or if those people lived there back then, but after all that, I've often wondered if it was the same house. Maybe that man was guarding the place. As for the woman, I hope I never see her again.